to development to peak. Is that how it works? We just work a lot at the foundation. I didn't even stress it in the one slide, but I had it written there. He recommends that you don't go beyond the foundation stage until you have mastered those movements. So you have to stay there until you can master those movements, and then you can develop them in combinations, and then you can add perceptual triggers. That's what he recommends in the book. I'm not calling him out fully, by the way, because he has some other good ideas when it comes to a bunch of different things. I'm just saying that's something that he wrote in the book. You got to stay there and then move on. So he's implying it's a linear progression. Is that really how skill acquisition works? If we consider how many different motor problems occur in a sports game, how will practicing perfect technique prepare us for all of those? You know, if I'm an offensive lineman and my coach is saying set up with like a certain degree knee bend and you have to be at this height all the time when you're pass setting, how will that prepare me to block a guy who's 6 foot 1 minute and a guy who's 6'6" the next minute? How is that one height going to help me with that? That one technique, that perfect physics-based angle of, you know, a certain shin angle when you're making a cut step. How will that prepare me when I turn around as a guy in my face right now and I'm in this position right here? What am I going to do? Right? I can't achieve that perfect technique. I guess I'm getting tackled. Right? How does that account for all of the problems that we're going to face? So that leads us into the case against some of the closed change of direction drills and the overemphasis on these. So we're going to talk about some discussion points from ecological dynamics and dynamical systems theory. I'm not going to be like crazy sciencing out with you guys today. So I know you guys are scienced out right now, right? But these terms are just the terms that they use. They're big and fancy. It is what it is. All right? The first main point is that technique and skill is not a result of quote-unquote perfect movement. All right? Technique and skill are the results of an athlete who can capitalize on the fixed principles of movement called attractors, which we'll get into later. But the attractors are things that we just have to accept are true. Right? If you want to be stable when you change direction, you have to lower your center of mass to some degree. Right? That's an attractor. So it's a matter of fixed principles of movement in combination with varying execution. Right? So the whole thing is accomplishing the sports task, whatever that takes. All right, so understanding what I know I have to do and where's my wiggle room to solve this task. So we get into attractors versus fluctuations. These are big fancy words that are not that scary when you really think about what they are. So attractors, also known as biomechanical truths. Like I said before, these are stable, economical components of a movement. It's not a specific body posture. It's just a principle. Like I said before, you need to lower your center of mass to become more stable when you want to change direction. So if I'm up here and I want to change direction, it's going to be kind of hard. If I sink even a little bit, it's easier. And then here I can get more powerful, whatever. All right, so I know to some degree I have to lower my center of mass. If I'm a quarterback, I have to externally rotate my shoulder before I internally rotate it and throw the football. I can't do this. Right? That never happens. So these are attractors. These are things that happen. The more stable we can capitalize on these fixed principles that have to happen for movement expression, the more stable we're going to be, and that allows us to capitalize on our wiggle room a little bit better because it's less things that we have to control, because we can already control these things. So here are some examples of attractors. Right? I talked about it before, lowering the center of mass. Right? We have Barry Sanders. He's obviously low to the ground. He's changing direction. We have Harrison Smith, local boy from the Vikings. He's got to sink his center of mass to take down Pat Devlin on the Patriots. Otherwise, he's getting run over. He's got to lower that to handle the high forces. That's an attractor. Here's another simple example. You got to plant your foot outside your center of mass to some degree to change direction. And the foot plant's going to have to be in the opposite direction that you're going. So if I want to go this way, I obviously have to plant my foot here in the opposite direction outside my center of mass to move back this way. That's an attractor. It's a fixed principle of movement that we can't really debate. It just happens. Another one, just as an example, flexion forward rotation of the hips. When you're stopping suddenly, you need to squat right now. Right? You can see how, I think it's Emmett Smith, Adrian Peterson, they're both doing it. right? Those are attractors. Now fluctuations, like I said before, that's the wiggle room. Right? If we looked at that picture previously, Evan Smith was a different hip height than Adrian Peterson was when they were doing the same movement. Right? The fluctuations allow the athletes to find solutions for the specific situation they find themselves in. Right? So if they don't have time to get really low into an awesome power cut position, does it mean that they can't succeed in the task? No, because they know I just need to get low enough to make some kind of a cut to make the guy miss. And that's where the fluctuations come in. The technique will change depending on a specific situation, but it will still adhere to the attractors and the biomechanical truths of movement, or else that movement will not be successful. It's as simple as that. So here's some examples of fluctuations. These are all different guys making a cut move. Right? Some of them are doing more of a crossover cut, some of them are more of a power cut. Look at the differences in hip height and how they're using two different styles of cutting. The task is the same, avoid the opponent laterally. But these are the fluctuations of how these guys are solving that task. Right? You can see even two guys doing the same thing. I think that might be Darren Sproles there. He's a lot lower than Jamal Charles in terms of his cut. Right, the situation is different. They're two different guys. They have different bodies. Those are fluctuations. Same thing with quarterbacks. Different forms of releases, depending on where they need to throw the ball, how they need to get there, what's happening. Like if you look at Phillip Rivers' face, I bet he's right about to get just smacked right in the gut by D-line. He's like, man, I need to get this off somehow. Right? My favorite fluctuation-based quarterback is Brett Favre. You watch him, just he can heave it 1 minute, the next minute he's getting tackled and he just does something crazy like that. He finds a way to get the job done somehow. Those are fluctuations. So here's another good principle behind the support for using open chaotic drills is that information guides the movement. Right? The perception action cycle. You got to perceive something in order to act. Right? If I am a wide receiver in football and they throw the football to me and I turn around and there's nobody there, I'm sprinting in a straight line to the end zone. I'm not just going to do some crazy I'm not going to do anything like that. I'm just going to run full speed to the end zone. I don't even have to cut or anything. But if I turn around and there's somebody in my face, that's some new information now. So I have to perceive that and figure out how to act in order to solve that task. So the information, athletes need to be explorers. Right? They learn to make their own decisions and create functional solutions, functional actions, and they perceive, and then they act, and after they act, they have to perceive again. Because if they see a guy there and they decide to act and cut this way, and that guy moves that way, they got to figure out something else. Right? So it's a constant cycle. And we cannot ignore the perceptual elements of movement in the sport. So a lot of guys watch film, and they say, kind of like Ian Jeffries in a way, oh, they cut step, they shuffle, they backpack. These are the movements. We just need to work these. Right? That's what they're doing. So they're focusing on the output in terms of what the movement result is. But we know from Bernstein, I promised Sean I would throw his name in. Right? If we know from him that we have to understand how something emerges in order to fully understand it. So why are they cut stepping to begin with? It's because of something that they're perceiving. Right? The receiver's not going to cut if there's nobody there. He's going to run to the end zone. So two movements can look exactly the same between a drill and what they see in the game. And people say, great, there's transfer. Look at that. It's the same exact movement. But if we ignore the perceptual side of it, what they're perceiving, what they're reading, the psychology of it, right? The ecological psychology, then it's not the same movement. It's totally different. It's a completely different experience for the athlete. Constraints. Everybody's been talking about it, so I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but they set the boundaries for performance. Right? They dictate our affordances, the fancy word for just what's the environment providing for me, how am I going to react to it? What is it affording for me to do? That's all it means. It's nothing crazy. And the constraints just mean hey, I'm constrained right now, I got to figure out something. Or I don't have many constraints and I can just do whatever I want. Alright, so obviously a performer constraints could be something physical. Maybe I'm trying to play receiver, I'm not that tall, so I got to compensate by jumping. I got to overcome that constraint. Psychological constraints, something people tend to ignore, largely important. A big focus of my own personal research right now. Athlete is a first-round draft pick, bust in the NFL. How does that happen? Obviously, he's not physically constrained. He's a specimen. It's up here. He doesn't know how to handle the psychology of the NFL. And then we talk about limiting factors of performance, lack of strength, power, speed. That's where we as physical preparation people, strength coaches, we come in and we work on that. And here's what we can definitely work on at the bottom, that a lot of us tend not to understand, is we can fix or at least help some of the poorly developed perceptual abilities of these athletes. I shouldn't say fix, right? It's never a fix. It's a constant we have to work at it all the time. And we have environmental constraints, obviously the physical environment, what's the field look like, all that jazz. And then we have the socio-cultural experience and the socio-cultural environment. What's that athlete's home life like? What are his friends like? Who is he surrounded by? All right? Why? Another reason why guys psychologically start to go down is because of their socio-cultural constraints. And obviously task constraints, these are things we can definitely control as coaches. What are the rules of the game? What's the equipment used? Size of the playing space? Players involved, right? We know we can work on these things. Carl Newell's constraints model, just a quick picture of it. They all come together, help form coordination and control. Right? That's the theory. Variation. This is something I've been playing around with a lot in what I do with my athletes. Repetition without repetition. How many times have you guys heard that the last 2 days? A lot? I think when Sean goes to bed at night and he dreams, he just keeps repeating repetition without repetition throughout the night. I think that's like, his mantra for life right there. While he's sleeping under his portrait of Bernstein above his bed. Basically, all it means is that 2 repetitions in the game are never the same. Obvious, right? If we think about it, it's obvious. It's not like this crazy groundbreaking thing. It's never going to happen the same way twice in a row. So here's the football coach in practice. Bring it back, run it again. Let's get it right this time. Blows the whistle. Line it up, let's do it. Scout team, you know what's coming, but don't be a hero. Oh, great. Okay, so I'm going to suck on purpose. In the game, you can't do that. When I was in college, my first year, and I was playing in Rhode Island, I was on scout team, and I had no idea what I was doing. I was just reading the situation. And I was tagging up our ball carriers. And the coach was like, they're not going to do that in the game. I'm like, I don't even know what I'm doing, and I'm doing it. So what do you mean they're not going to do that in the game? Of course they are. So they kept trying to run these screens and whatever, and I was just tagging them up because I'm just reading the quarterback who's doing this. Okay, I know the ball's going over there, right? In the game, they tried to run it. TFLs, left and right, tackles for loss. All right, so can he bring it back in a game? No. So why do we need to practice that way? If I'm a coach and they get it wrong, whatever, move on, let's bring it back later. All right? Or let's just throw it out because it doesn't work. So effective coaches, they seem to use a very simple approach and a lot of variation within that. And that goes for practice, the weight room, everything. A simple approach with variation within that. All right? We don't have to overcomplicate the framework, right? But we can switch things up and keep it fun. That brings us into the concept of part practice versus whole practice. Whole practice, it's like going to football practice. You're practicing the sport, right? It's when the sensory motor experience is very similar, if not exactly the same as what it will be in the game. It won't ever truly be exactly the same because you don't have 50,000 people in the stands at practice or whatever it might be. But sensory motor in terms of the movement and the emergence of that, pretty much the same in practice, right? It automatically guarantees transfer in terms of the perception-action cycle. All right, so we know that if we practice football, it's going to help us with football, right? However, some aspects of that might not improve in whole practice alone. And that's where we might have to scale back and figure out how to carefully construct part practice, which we'll go over next, and how we can then work on helping out something, alleviating a certain issue, performance inhibitor, and then try to put them back in the whole practice and see what happens. So part practice, it can be very different from the sensory motor experience of the game. It can be very different. Doing a ladder drill I think we can all agree is nothing like what's going to happen in the game. Nothing like it. Doing a cone drill, nothing like the game. All right, completely different. The movement might be similar, but it's not at all the same sensory motor experience at all. All right, so if we can find a way to do part practice where the sensory motor package stays linked and together and combined, now we have a chance of maybe making some change. All right, that's stuff that we can do in practice in terms of individual drills. If we're talking about football, or you can do some small-sided games. If you're talking about soccer or rugby or something like that, we can do one-on-one drills, two-on-two drills. A lot of the stuff that Scott was showing in his videos of what they're doing at Texas Tech, that's a form of part practice. The sensory motor experience is at least something like the game. Right? I know I got to get around somebody in the game. You know, sometimes I got to get around 10 guys in the game, but I know at least I got to get around one. So that's a scaled back version of whole practice. So it's a different form of part practice that's a lot more similar in terms of sensory motor. All right? So here's the other thing, right? Ian Jeffries